Viney family curator of the New England Quilt Museum. She publishes on quilt history and lectures nationally on quilt making and quilt history, telling stories of the Civil War, women's history, and industrial history. Quilts became her focus following the bicentennial in 1976, when I must say I also got hooked on American deck arts. And she began making traditional quilts with calicos at that point. By the mid-'80s, she was designing her own work and was considered an art quilter, making quilts based in tradition with an emphasis on non-traditional color. A class with Nancy Crowe sent her into the world of hand-dyed fabrics and improvisational quilts. Crowe, one of the leading figures in the development of the art quilting movement of the 70s and 80s, believes that the purpose of her quilts is to make something beautiful while representing experiences and feelings. Pam's work does all of this while incorporating her perception of color and color relationships, shapes, line, and linear movement. Complexity, sadness, and hope are things that run through her work.
Where did you find that?
In 1991, Pam took a class on reproducing antique quilts and waistcoats. Her first book was published in 2013 on Civil War quilts made for soldiers, the subject of her talk and book signing today. Civil War quilts will be available in our museum shop following her talk. And welcome, Pam. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here today, and I need to tell you that we're going to be talking about a quilt that was made in Hingham as we get farther into the presentation. It's not my first visit here. I came to this very room to have a look through what Hingham had for information on the Civil War. Now, while the thought is in my head, I'm a very informal speaker, and I would prefer that you raise your hand and ask questions as we go along. And I will be asking questions of you as we go along. Now, the first one I want to ask is, how many of you in this room are quilters? All right, you may not answer the next question. What's a quilt? Can someone give me a definition of a quilt who's not a quilter? Then if nobody figures that out, we'll fall back on you quilters. What's a quilt? What makes a quilt different from a blanket?
It's an assembly of pieces.
It's an assembly of pieces that's often on the top and sometimes decorates the back as well. I gave you a hint. It has a top.
Decorative.
It's decorative.
Artistic.
Someone said it has layers. It's got stuff in it.
Artistic.
It makes use of materials that were used before,
Sometimes
even before that.
Sometimes. That's one of the myths of quilt making, is that they're always made from recycled
I
materials.
say always.
Okay, thank you. Historians hate that word, always. So basically what a quilt is, it has 3 layers. A blanket has 1. A quilt is generally decorated on the top with piecing. It has generally a plain back, but some art quilters today are using both sides. Some quilters in the 19th century used both sides to decorate. But what makes it a quilt is there is stitching that holds 3 layers together: top, backing, and batting or wadding in the middle. It can be done by hand, it can be done by machine, or it can be tied. So those are 3 ways to hold the layers together. So, my next question: how many of you hated history as much as I did in school? Just a few. I figured I know, so you'll live. It's okay. So I didn't like history in school because it was all about men, dates, and war. Men, dates, and war. Sorry guys, there's not meaning to disparage the men in the room. But if you're a 16-year-old girl, and like me, I was a pretty big tomboy, I knew my family. I'm the 10th generation in my family to live in New Hampshire. And it was like, where are the women? Well, what I learned when I fell in love with antique quilts is that there are 2 ways to learn history. And the first way is through the written word, and the second way is through stuff. What stuff do you love that's going to turn you into a historian, as quilts turned me into one? That's called material culture studies. When you learn history through whether it's a 1959 Chevy El Camino that you fall in love with and you aren't going to be happy until you learn about automotive history, or whether it's a gorgeous peridot ring, which I just was given, and now I have to go research peridot and find out what's different about them. Whatever you fall in love with that makes you want to learn more about it, that's material culture studies. So, nobody was surprised as me when I wrote my first book on Civil War quilts, because I had other things I wanted to write books about, but it made sense. Now let's see if we can make this work properly. Yes! So, inscribed quilts are quilts that are written on, and you have a beauty over here in your collection, which I hope you'll have a chance to look at later. Inscribed quilts were a fad in the 19th century. How many of you had autograph albums in school? Or had people sign your yearbook with messages? Same thing. So in the beginning of the 19th century, it was very popular for women to have albums, women and men to have albums where their friends would inscribe verses. And it jumped to quilts. The earliest one we've documented so far is 1836. They are wonderful because the bad news is too many women in the 19th century did not sign their work. So if you have an inscribed quilt with multiple names on it, you have a pretty good chance of figuring out who made it, where it was made if you're lucky, and if you're very lucky, why. So I've told you I was the 10th generation. I'm the 10th generation in my father's side and the 12th in my mother's side to live in New Hampshire. So I fell in love with inscribed quilts and antique quilts, and if I've got that many great-grandmothers out there, somewhere I'm going to find a quilt in an antique shop or in an auction that has a great-grandmother's name on it. And I thought I found one. This is a quilt that is inscribed with the name Sarah A. Levitt, December 16th, 1847. And I was away, and I sent my auntie to the auction to buy it. And when I came back from Amsterdam, she said, "You're not going to like this quilt. It's really weird." And there are 2 seats up front, 2 guys. So I went up to see her, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "It's made of blocks that are all individually bound and sewn together." And that's not the usual way that you make a quilt. This quilt is made by sewing all the blocks together, so you have a complete top, and you have the layers quilted together. The reproduction that I brought, that I use for my lectures, is made block by block. All the blocks are individually bound, and they're sewn together. And for lack of a better name, we call them potholder quilts. And they're quite rare. I fell in love with them. I knew other people were studying it. They gave me permission to study it. And I found out later, behind my back, they made a bet that I'd never find more than 50 of them. I'm up to 237. The fun part is they're almost all inscribed. And the reason I think people switch to making potholder quilts for some reasons is because you can assign a group of people to make a quilt for somebody, tell them to make all the blocks 12 inches square, quilted and bound, and bring them back and sew them together. We're going to get into that in more detail in just a minute. One of the reasons the inscribed quilts were made was there were lots of people leaving New England and the East Coast for the West. There were a lot of groups of people who wanted to give a beautiful gift to a revered minister in their church. Many of these were presentation quilts where women in the church would sign and make a quilt. There's actually 2 anecdotes of a woman dying of consumption, and all her friends who came to visit her signed a block, and her daughter made a quilt afterwards. So inscribed quilts were made for presentation, they were made for commemoration, and made to reify a community, especially if you were leaving. I have a quilt that was made for my first wedding at my shower, and of the 35 signatures on it, there are only 15 of us who are still alive. So I have my grandmother's signature on my quilt. And you can just think about that for a minute and imagine how important these inscribed quilts were for people. All right, what I'm going to do, Sandy, how long do you want me to speak?
Till about 4.
It's 3:15. Shall I go? I'll go till just a few minutes before 4. All right. So, how did I get interested in Civil War quilts? Well, I was researching potholder quilts. I was trying to get a lot in my database so I could understand the what and the why. I'm a member of the American Quilt Study Group, which is a group of about 2,000 quilt history geeks like me. And we study quilt history from as early as they were made until what's going on in the modern quilt guild now. We're studying everything in our beloved genre. And I stood up with my potholder reproduction in front of them and I said, "Hi, my name is Potholder Pam." And just like you, they laughed. And I said, "Usually when you're doing research, you keep it quiet, but I know I can't keep this quiet because these puppies are rare and I need you to become my potholder posse." And they did. And they started sending me emails and I'd print them and I'd take all the information and I'd put them in my notebook. And one day my mentor said to me, "Are you ever going to get serious about this? You're having a lot of fun." And I said, "Yeah, it's fun to find them." And she said, "Just take a minute and put everything in chronological order." And we were together in a hotel room at a conference, and I did that, and I went dead quiet. And for those of you who know me, when I go dead quiet, something's going on. And she said, "What is it?" And I said, 6 of these were made for Civil War soldiers. And she went quiet, because we both knew how rare Civil War soldiers' quilts are. I'm going to flash through a lot of them. The one in the upper left-hand corner is now in the collection of the Maine State Museum. They got it at auction. They disappeared for a long time, but it had been published, so we knew about it. The one in the middle was made in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts, on the North Shore. It's in the collection in Rochester, New York. The one on the lower right belongs to the New England Quilt Museum. And we've had it out a few times for people who want to come see it. These all happen to be potholder quilts. So, why do we tangle quilts up with the Civil War? Well, at the beginning of the war, neither the North or the South were prepared for the mass recruitment of hundreds of thousands of men. Now, New Hampshire history I know better, so if anybody knows your Massachusetts Civil War history, jump in. Depending on what town so every state had a number of, had a recruitment goal, and every town had a recruitment goal, and every town and partially state was expected to prepare the young men to go off to war. And depending on what town you were from, you either got the whole kit if you were a rich town. Claremont, New Hampshire, there's a wonderful paper written about that to compare 2 towns. Sent every soldier off not only with complete kit and a Bible and a $5 gold piece, but there was a $5 gold piece left with his family so that his family was taken care of when he left. The town next door, Newport, gathered the guys and got them on the train. So it was really raggedy, and the goal was to prepare the soldier, as you can see in the right-hand slide. The illustrations from the 1860s are wonderful. This is one, I think, from Leslie's newspaper of a recruitment parade, and you can see the gentleman in the middle with his sack over his shoulder and his civvies. That's how many men went off to war. There was a lot of stuff, so Johnny would write home to Mom, and believe it or not, with the trains, the letters were going back and forth quickly, saying, "Mom, I'm cold, I need a coat, I need mittens, I need a quilt." She would pack up the stuff and send it off. And the problem was he might not still be where his letter originated from. A second problem was there was a great deal of chaos in the shipping centers, and throughout the war, people who were making stuff were really concerned their stuff wasn't going where it needed to go. So, before the war started, actually, there were a group of women in New York that started something called the Women's Central Association of Relief, which eventually morphed to become part of the United States Sanitary Commission, which after the war turned into what? Do you know? The Red Cross. The Red Cross, correct. But the purpose of the Sanitary Commission was threefold at the beginning: to recruit and train nurses, to make conditions better in the hospitals, for the wounded on battlefields, to get the wounded to the hospitals sooner, and to improve the conditions in camp. One of the women involved had served with Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War, where 12 men died of disease for every one who died on the battlefield. And she didn't want that to happen in the Civil War. They formed the organization, they changed a lot of conditions. Still during the Civil War, 8 men died for every one on the battlefield. Do I have that right? I think it's 8. 7 or 8, but it was less than 12. And so the third reason was to get stuff donated by the greater communities in the North, and to get it where it was needed, and to try to make sure that it wasn't stolen and sold on the black market. They published a newspaper every 2 weeks, and the running theme, if you read a few months of them, are those 3 things. This is the stuff we need, we're getting it where it needs to go, and we're trying to make sure that it's not stolen. So this is just that New York assemblage of women, and if you look at the numbers, 21,429 quilts during this 4 period. The Sanitary Commission kept wonderful records, and a quilt that was made in Hingham would have gone through the sanitary rooms in Boston. It would have been counted, and you would have received, if you were the makers of the Hingham Ladies' Aid Society, you would have received a thank you note from the Boston offices, and everything you donated got counted and acknowledged. So a quilt historian named Virginia Gunn, on whose shoulders I stand, did a wonderful paper in the 1980s and extrapolated, after reviewing as many of the Sanitary Commission records as she could, that more than 250,000 quilts, 250,000 quilts were made during the 4-year period of the Civil War. The Sanitary Commission, we'll get into it in just a minute, but many, many towns, and it's the northern history that I know best. I don't know a lot about the southern history, but many towns across the north, especially associated with church and doing benevolent work, already had ladies' aid societies. One historian has done research and shown that at the time the war started, there were 8,000 ladies' aid societies in the north. Within 6 months of the start of the war, there were 20,000 ladies' aid societies. And they were making all kinds of stuff. One of the myths that I love to bust is that the sewing machine wasn't in common use at the time of the Civil War. What do you think the lady on the left is doing? Sitting at her sewing machine. If you were trying to make stuff for the boys and you had a sewing machine, you're going to use it. So the Sanitary Commission, again, I think we'll just go through this quickly. This is one of them, a beautiful illustration from 1862. Upper left-hand corner, nurses on the battlefield. Upper right-hand corner, nurses in hospital. Lower left-hand corner, women making things for the cause, giving comfort in the large cartouche in the center. And the lower right is something that doesn't get talked about often, but there were what were called sanitary fairs. And it was the Sanitary Commission, and they raised millions of dollars for the war cause during the war. There was a major one in Boston. I think there were smaller ones in smaller communities. The biggest, gigantic one, I think, was New York. Chicago had huge ones. They had them all over California. At one time, California sent $2 million in cash to Washington for their sanitary fairs. This is what they wanted. In October of 1861, they sent a beautiful letter to the northern papers. And it starts beautifully. You can get it online. Dear, oh, I've just lost the words. Faithful women of the North, or something like that it started. If you want to help the war cause, this is what you can do. And it went on page after page, but I've just taken out a few of them. And one of the hints that I use often is they wanted quilts of cheap material, about 7 feet long by 50 inches wide. Why long and narrow? Cots is correct. And if you become interested in the Civil War, and Deb said beautiful things about me coming in, these ladies are part of a reenactment group. If you ever do an event and want reenactors, you're still doing the Sanitary Commission's tent, right?
Always.
Always. They do a wonderful job with it. You can get online the actual patterns for the socks that were made, the mittens, and the book that's for sale downstairs has some of the quilting patterns. So a working definition of a soldier's quilt, it was documented for a specific soldier or bears the United States Sanitary Commission stamp. Or it has 2 or more of the following characteristics. It's long and narrow, made of cheap materials. They often have patriotic symbols or colors. And you can see the very simple quilt that I'm using for the background. Those are individual blocks, but is there any question that that red, white, and blue has a purpose? And the majority of them have multiple inscriptions. Names, places, dates, hymns, patriotic signs, Bible verses. The signed quilts that survive are from the end of the war, and we have anecdotes that the soldiers in the worst condition in the hospitals would have one of these quilts laid over them, and the nurses or the male nurses in better shape would read the inscriptions from them and to cheer the boys. And that's why some of these verses. And then there's a hilarious one that was made in Augusta, Maine, and survived the war, and it does actually have riddles on it based on Bible knowledge. Question?
Do any of the quilts that were made for specific soldiers get to them?
There are a couple. I take it back, there's one, and that's our next slide. So you've all heard of Godey's Ladies Book, of Peterson's magazine. You would not believe how neutral they stayed during the war, because they were selling magazines to the North and the South, and I don't think it was until 1863 or 1864 that either one of them made a stand for the Union. This is the only quilt pattern that appears in any books of the period, any magazines of the period, and what you're looking at in the upper left-hand corner is a half page from Peterson magazine. How many of you quilters today go to the quilt shop, buy the pattern, get the instructions, have somebody help you pick out the fabrics, the patterns are full size, admit it, nobody's going to admit it? In those days, you could look at a picture and your needlework skills would have gotten you through the project. The quilt in the background is one of several that have very similar construction, and this one was made for George Teeter. George served in Indiana. He was too young the first two tries, and they figured out he was only 15 and then 16, and he finally mustered toward the end of the war, and his mother made it, and it has quilted in it, in lines hard to see, all the generals that he served under. And it's in the Smithsonian, and if you're interested, you can go right online, look up their website, and there's a whole lot more information there. This quilt is one of the ones that's made of cheap material, and it's actually, I was able to examine it and see that this is one of the cases where recycled fabric was used. Because you can see in the borders, and that's the image smack in the middle is a piece of the close-up of the fabric. You can see where hems were released. You can see worn pieces, worn lines that go down it. It's a wonderful story. It was made by Mrs. L.B. Fairbanks, as you can see, of Brandon, Vermont. Not only does it have the Sanitary Commission logo on it, it also has there's a little stamp that said Ladies Aid Society, Brandon, Vermont. It was founded, so they just donated stuff, and they expected their stuff to be used and not for any specific people. There was some hopes that a Vermont quilt would go to a Vermont boy. And the last quilt we'll talk about today is a Maine quilt that had a letter attached to it that way. What's fun is when you have pictures of them. That quilt was found in Pennsylvania. They decided that a Vermont quilt should go back to Vermont. When it did, newspaper articles were written about it, and the family came forward and said, my great-grandparents are Caro and Luke Fairbanks, and they did a lot of genealogical research and provided the museum with images of the quilt maker and her husband. This is one of my favorite quilts because the story is just fabulous. This quilt is in the collection of the Lincoln Shrine in Redlands, California, and I was astonished to go to visit that. I go look at all the quilts. I don't care where they are, just go. And the Lincoln Shrine was a very wealthy man after the Civil War, was a soldier, made millions of dollars in, I think, the railroads in the West, loved Lincoln, and began collecting everything Lincoln. And the collection contains this quilt, which was made in Vernon, Connecticut, and it was made for the soldiers, and the Sanitary Commission asked the makers not only to sign the quilt, but to attach notes. Or there are many anecdotes of mittens having notes attached to them, socks sort of thing, notes for the boys. And a note was attached to this one. So this was made by a group of Sunday school students in Vernon, Connecticut. The church is still there. I had a great deal of fun. I spoke to this group a couple of years ago, and they had no idea the quilt was made there. The historian had never told them that this is the church where the quilt was made, and it was kind of spooky for me to be there. But there was an age range of 10 years old to 25 years old in this grouping of young women who made the quilt. And it was given to Captain Robert Fisk, who had been out foraging with his men. The Confederates raided the camp, took all their food and bedding, and the next day the Sanitary Commission stepped in and gave them new bedding, which included this quilt. So he saw the names on the quilt, the little notes, and he wrote a note to one of the little Miss Chesters. There were 2 Chesters who signed the quilt. The letter came to Vernon, Connecticut. Her parents decided that a 10-year-old should not be answering the letter from a captain in the Army, so they got her older sister, Lizzie, to answer the question, the letter. A correspondence was started. After the war, Captain Fisk came to Connecticut to court Lizzie Chester and marry her.
Aww.
And this quilt could be a lecture all itself, so I'll just skim over it fast. Before the war, he and his 4 brothers went adventuring, and they very much wanted to explore the territory from southern Minnesota into Montana. The war scotched their plans. They came back. Believe it or not, all 4 brothers survived the war. He courted Lizzie in 1865. When she said yes, he said, "Thank you very much, I'll be back in 2 years." Because I want to go adventuring. So you can actually look up the Fisk expedition. And in 1867, he came back to Vernon, married Lizzie, put her on a boat. They went from the Connecticut coast into New York City, where he bought a printing press and a large supply of paper, went up the Mississippi River, ended up in what became Helena, Montana, where he established the first newspaper. And we know all this because Lizzie was, there are 2 in the front, actually 3 in the front. Lizzie wrote letters home all the time. Not only do those family letters survive, but that is a photograph of that very first letter that Captain Fisk wrote back to Lizzie. They're all in the Montana Historical Society. And it's a wonderful story about the Wild West because Lizzie was settled with him. They built a beautiful little house. There were some years that she wouldn't put her kids in school because there were too many whores kids in the school. And prostitutes. And she didn't want that influence on her children. And so there's actually been a little book written about Lizzie's letters, and it's a wonderful read from the period. His health failed, and they are buried in California. They moved to Berkeley in the 1890s. And talk about weird factoids you read. Do you know that there are no longer cemeteries in Berkeley? Because the land became so valuable that they moved all the cemeteries east. And when I went to the Berkeley Library to find out more about him, he knew it would be one of these 25 cemeteries where the people were buried. Because the other thing I love to do is visit their graves. But I haven't had the fortitude to start on that list of 25 cemeteries. All right, this is a Portland, Maine quilt that we're going to buzz right through, except that it's a wonderful story about a group of young women in the Portland area who got together and made this quilt. One of them is Cornelia Dow. Her father was the first Prohibition mayor of the city of Portland, who was elected in 1850. Do you think he won a second term? He did not. But we've done a lot of research on it's covered with wonderful poems. You can read one, "God bless the brave who go to save our country in her dark, dread time of danger." That's the kind of inscription that would have been on these quilts. That is Cornelia Maria Dow. Now for a little bit more fun. This is a potholder quilt that I first saw in the collection of the Brick Store Museum in Kennebunk, Maine. How many of you have been to Portland? How many of you know, I don't dare try to point, it always screws me up. See the top row? There's a red building. Do you know what that is? No. That's what I thought too.
Oh, that's the tower on the hill.
And what's it called? It's called the Portland Observatory. And the Portland Observatory was built in the I've got to go back and look at that information. It's 1810s or 1820s. So imagine the bustling port of Portland. This is out on the hill. You can probably just barely see all the little semaphore poles that are there. You could buy into the observatory if you were a ship's captain. And the observatory was manned every light hour of the day. They would see your ship coming in from wherever, raise your company flags on those semaphores, and you would have time to get your people down the docks to make a place for your ship coming in. And this quilt was made by women who lived in the shadow of the Portland Observatory. Their names are all in the 1860 census, in which the majority of them are married to machinists. Because if you walk down the hill and into the port, you would land on top of a company called the Portland Company. The Portland Company made engines, armaments, steam engines, and this is a rendition of a double-ended steamer that was long and narrow that they could use in the rivers and not have to turn them around. And that's one of the things that the Portland Company made. All right, how many of you knew that there was a Civil War battle off the coast of Maine? 2. That's pretty good. Let me read you a little bit about it. The observatory played an important role in the only attack on Portland during the Civil War. Late in the day of June 26, 1863, a Confederate crew in command of the captured United States ship Archer, and the Archer had been captured off the coast of North Carolina and had not touched shore, so nobody knew that it had been captured. Anchored near the U.S. revenue cutter Caleb Cushing. During the night, the Confederate crew overpowered the Caleb Cushing's crew and towed both ships out of the harbor, but the wind died and they were becalmed 15 miles off the coast. In one version of the story, credit is given to Captain Enoch Moody, who was the founder of the Portland Observatory, was in the habit of early morning observations, saw the ships, and raised the alarm. The passenger steamers, Forest City, Casco, and Chesapeake, 2 leaving port and 1 coming up from Boston, were manned by armed citizens as well as soldiers and sailors, overtook the Confederate-held ships, and after a short battle, captured them. See what a quilt will teach you? So, my other nickname is Screaming Pam because I get excited and I start screaming. I told you how rare Civil War soldiers' quilts are. I did an exhibition at the New England Quilt Museum in 2011, which was my first exhibition there as an invited curator on potholder quilts. We called them 1 foot square quilted and bound. From the oldest one, which is in the collection of the Cochran Museum, it's dated 1836, to there's a wonderful fiber artist now who's making, imagine, little beautiful sea-colored cotton squares with wires in them. And she actually creates 3-dimensional waves by making the potholders curl, and everything in between. And I knew when I had that exhibition that other quilts would start coming out of the wall, out of the woodwork. And so when I got an email from a woman who was one of the curators at the Mystic Seaport Museum, she said, "I think we have a potholder quilt and you better come see it." So imagine how I became Screaming Pam when this quilt was laid in front of me. What do you see again? The Portland Observatory and the ship. And what I didn't point out to you, same eagle, same drums. That's the observatory. And this one as well. It has this Bible. There are 4 people who signed both quilts. This one has more Masonic symbols to it, and the Masonic lodge that sits at the base of the observatory is still there. So it was just amazing to know how rare these Civil War quilts are and to find a second related quilt. And there's the Portland Observatory. Not a bad job, huh?
Wow.
Not a lighthouse, as I learned. There's a potholder quilt in the private collection made in Florence, Mass. So IQSCM stands for International Quilt Study Center and Museum. And this one was made in Detroit, but the women who organized it, based on their names being in the center block, were from Nantucket. Pond quilts are almost always a New England thing. We found a few outside of New England, maybe before the 1870s, but not many. And this is the one that is in the collection of the New England Quilt Museum, showing the front and the back. This quilt stayed in the soldier's family, and it was donated to us in, I think it was 2003. And that's another lecture all by itself, and I'm just going to skip through this because I want to start talking about Hingham. How many of you have heard of the ladies of the Fort Hill Sewing Circle? What do you know? What do you know? I'm going to take one more hand in the back. There was a hand in the back of someone who's heard of them. What do you know?
As far as I can recall, they met, there was a group of ladies in the Fort Hill neighborhood. They met in a building which is now in the cemetery, not in the Fort Hill Cemetery, as I recall. Anyway, it was one of those Civil War groups that was sewing stuff for the soldiers, as I recall.
And what do you know?
At the Fort Hill Cemetery, there's a statue in their honor, actually.
That one? Let me go back to it for just a minute. So what I learned, I have been here doing research before, but there's also a tremendous amount online. Your Hingham history from 1893 is available online. Did I skip a page? I did. That's why my notes look weird. Okay. So you're close. The ladies of the Fort Hill Sewing Circle were already going by the 1850s. Your town history states that a group of women, of course their names were not included in this history, which was written in 1893, had raised money to make improvements to the Fort Hill Cemetery, one of the oldest burying grounds in the town. Its care had passed to the town in the late 1700s, but there had been few recent burials and it was falling to disrepair. And I quote, "The old neglected ground was waiting the advent of the spirit of some old mortality to redeem it from waste and desecration. This came at last, as so many excellent things do come from the devotion and labor of women." But we're not going to give you their names. I'm a little biased these days. The devoted group called a meeting in November of 1851, which resulted in the formation of the Fort Hill Sanitary Corporation. More land was purchased, the acreage was divided into lots, it was fenced, and trees were planted. The Hingham history goes on to report that the ladies continued their well-directed efforts, holding a fair each year for the sale and products of their labor. And when I was preparing for this talk, I had forgotten that I took this picture from one of your newspapers here. As will be seen by advertisement, this popular fair will take place on Wednesday, January 20th, and I think this is 1861. As everybody expects to attend this fair, the mere announcement that one is to be held is enough to secure a crowded house. And they raised lots and lots of money. I'm going to come back to your quilt in just a minute. In that year, they donated $2,000. So you can imagine how many things they were sewing and selling to do that. All right, so my book is called Civil War Quilts, and I have a co-author, and his name is Donald Bell. And Donald Bell was pestering me about Civil War quilts. What did I know? I wasn't ready to share with him because I needed to do more research. And then he sent me the picture on the left. And I said, "Where is that quilt?" And he said, "It's in private hands. I have permission to share it with just you." So we started doing research on it. It was made in Hingham. It is dated 1864. And I want you to know, standing in front of you, that I tried my best to either have the owners donated to the New England Quilt Museum or to the Hingham Historical Society. And they chose instead. I have not found that it's been definitely donated, but it is in the possession of the International Quilt Study Center and Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. I tried. This is what it looks like on the left. I was there a couple of years ago when they had it on display, and it is a really typical Civil War soldier's potholder quilt. And you can see that I've made a few of the blocks in my reproduction quilt. All right, so let me tell you who's on it. Oh, I did that again. So it has a Sanitary Commission stamp, which is an amazing thing. And it is inscribed, and this one says, "The Soldier's Friend, Aunt Betsy." So it's a potholder quilt. There are 54 9-inch blocks, individually finished in double pink. There are lots of different blocks. Many of the blocks bear patriotic messages, Bible verses, and homely sayings meant to send the recipient comforting words from home. The dates range from June to July 1864, and the signatures on the quilt include those of the officers of the sewing circle written on one of the blocks. And this is the block that contains the officer's name. Now, the president was Elizabeth Lincoln Newhall, signed as would be appropriate at the time, Mrs. Joseph Newhall. The vice president, Rebecca Gardner, was the wife of Andrew Gardner. He is listed in the census as a shoemaker. They had 4 children living at home at the time of the 1860 census. And the eldest is Lucy, who I believe her name is also on the quilt, and I love the census. She is engaged in the shoe trade as a tassel maker. At least 7 of the signatories on the quilt represent 3 generations of people related to each other through Mrs. Daniel or Priscilla Kane, who was 86 when the quilt was made. Those related to her include the Lincolns and the Stodders. Anybody descendants of those people? I figured we'd have some. All right. These are the names that I could transcribe from the quilt.
He lived down on South Street.
Sorry.
No, speak right out.
Daniel Kane lived down on South Street. When the Italian immigrants came to town, my great-grandfather bought the house.
Can you all hear her?
Yeah, my great-grandfather bought his house and raised 10 kids there.
Wow. No, I made this slide specifically for this talk so that you all could see who signed the quilt and we'd see who was related, if anybody.
I wonder who Aunt Betsy was.
If somebody has the time and could do the deep research, there's probably an Elizabeth in one of these family circles. The other thing that often happens, and again, this is one quilt that I've only been able to see on display. I haven't been able to really look at it. So I don't have all of the names. Often women would make 2 or 3 blocks for a quilt like this, and so you have multiple signatures on them. All right, so 2 of the signers had family members serving in the war at the time when the quilt was made. Daniel and Priscilla Lincoln's son, Daniel Stoddard Lincoln, enlisted at the beginning of the war as a 90-day volunteer in the Lincoln Light Inventory, a unit raised from Hingham and surrounding South Shore towns. So cue you.
All right, the Lincoln Light Infantry had a building at Hingham Center off the Common, which was later used as an armory. And that building is now a garage on Middle Street. And they trained and drilled out of there before they left. Today, the Hingham Armory Division, the Transportation Division, the 1058th, is allowed to have on their letterhead, Lincoln Light Infantry, because their work goes all the way back to that particular group.
So just tell us a little bit more. The Lincoln Light Infantry was one of the 90-day units?
Yes.
And they completely disbanded after those 90 days?
No.
They didn't?
They stayed as a militia and became part of the state militia.
Got it. Got it. Well, the history that I got was that Daniel Lincoln mustered out in July, but returned to the service in the Navy. In 1864, was serving aboard the supply steamer Connecticut, sailing between Boston, Pensacola, Florida, and Mobile, Alabama. He survived the war, returned to Hingham to work as a shoemaker, but died in 1869 of scarlet fever. Nancy Corcoran, a member of the committee or the sewing circle, signed her name Mrs. J.J. Cochran, which was for Jeremiah. Her husband enlisted in the Lincoln Light Infantry as a 90-day volunteer, But at the end of this service, he enlisted as a private in Company A of the Massachusetts 40th Volunteers for 3 years. His tours were in the Department of the South. Now, there's another wonderful book, Hingham in the Civil War, and it lists the various battles in which Corcoran fought, and also an account of his action at Cold Harbor, which was a very bloody battle in Virginia.
The 54th is going to be part of the Lincoln Day celebration. I think it is every year.
Awesome. Are you guys affiliated with the 54th?
On the 10th of February.
The 54th, like today's 54th?
Yeah.
Cool. So tell me more about that celebration. No, we can't. All right, never mind.
Someone else come. No, it's a celebration of about Benjamin Lincoln, because he was an ancestor of Abraham Lincoln and one of the first settlers of this town, and a very important part of the American Revolution. And we have the Benjamin Lincoln House here and all sorts of, and somebody else can be a little bit more.
So would this be the same Lincoln family?
Yes.
Got it.
No,
Question in the
they're
back?
not.
They're not?
Okay.
Abraham Lincoln is descended from Samuel Lincoln.
Yes.
From the West Country. Benjamin Lincoln is descended from Thomas Lincoln. I'm sorry, Thomas Lincoln was from the West Country. Samuel Lincoln was from Hingham. And there were originally 8 Lincoln families that settled in Hingham. 3 of them were brothers. That was part of the Abraham Lincoln patrimony. But Benjamin is from an entirely different.
Where does Mordecai come in?
Thank you.
Mordecai is Samuel's son.
Ah.
Perfect. So back to Jeremiah Cochran. He was, so he was wounded in the Battle of Cold Harbor, which was fought over several days from the end of May into June 10th, 1864. In 1/2 hour period on June 3rd, the day that Jeremiah Cochran was wounded, more than 7,000 Union soldiers died in an assault on Confederate lines. Corcoran survived the battle but died in a hospital a week later on June 10th, 1864. The research, so when I was doing research here, you have a wonderful stock of old newspapers. And I was able to read in the Hingham Journal Advertiser on January 1st, 1864, something that made a lover of signature quilts just quiver. Other Hingham groups made quilts for the war, and there's this excerpt that we confirm that the signature album quilts were intended for hospital use. And I quote, "The scholars of the Universalist Sabbath School have lately sent a quilt to the sanitary rooms, and the pupils of one of our grammar schools have made an album quilt," which is another word for inscribed quilt, "and will forward it as a New Year's gift for the sick and wounded soldiers." All right, so I have a few pictures of the quilt. This one is kind of pieced together, but it has some very interesting and unusual blocks in it.
Yeah.
Yes.
What makes them unusual? Is it the type of fabric? Or
So
the type
what
of
makes them
stitching?
unusual is this one up with the red binding.
Okay.
Those are little printed pictures of the flag. And that is a little printed picture of George Washington in the middle. These are much more typical piecework, but this quilt has 2 or 3 blocks that are just kind of strange and weird that you don't see in other inscribed quilts in the period. Here's another one that's unusual, so I'm sure they were repurposing fabric. This looks like it's pieced, but it's printed fabric from somebody's dress. And then if I was really trying to make a quick quilt, I wouldn't make a block of triangles, I would do other things.
So Pam, one other thing. So you're saying that most of those quilts were not made with repurposed fabric, they were purchased fabric specifically for the quilt?
They go both ways. Of all the Civil War soldiers' potholder quilts I've examined, I'd say about 60% were made of purchased fabric. About 40%, some of the blocks show clothing wear, like a released hem or something like that. Blocks like that make me suspicious that that's what she had on hand, and she did. The Sanitary Commission bulletins are full of stories, at least 4 that I know of women using up everything. And one quilt coming in with some pieces that are no bigger than a ½ inch because she was using everything up. But there are just as many records of local sanitary or local ladies' aid societies raising money to purchase fabric. So it can be both. It can be both. Question?
I'm curious about the ink that was used, whether instead of embroidering her names or her messages, was there a technological invention that made indelible ink at the time?
So the answer is yes. There was a technological advance in the 1820s, and that's what most quilt historians say allowed that to jump to the quilts. So women were putting inventory numbers on all their linens. They were already marking their linens with ink. Payson's indelible ink, I think, was 1821 or 1824. The steel-tipped nib came about 1804, so those are the 2 technological advances. But what I'm finding is that some of the quilts are just beautifully marked, and some of them have splotches on them. So people were in a hurry the Vermont quilt is splotched all over the place. That baby she was in a hurry to finish that puppy. But just imagine, dip pen, 3 minutes.
No, just keep going.
Oh, keep going, all right. So yes, there was, and you had a question?
Why did they say cheap fabric? I think you gave an answer, but
I haven't given that answer. They said cheap fabric because they wanted you to be able to afford a quilt that they knew was going to get washed and beaten on and stolen and used up. So don't spend a lot of time on it. Any more questions here? We'll just skip right through it and we'll go to the last story. Another unusual block. I've never seen anything pieced that way before. Now, my last story is about a quilt that landed at the Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C. And we know it was there because we found records of its making. And here's what it looked like when it was sent from Montana to Belfast, Maine. It was in tough condition. Megan Pinette is the director of the Historical Society there, and about, I guess it's 4 years now, she got a phone call from somebody in Montana saying, "We have a Civil War quilt that we're pretty sure was made in Belfast. Would you like it?" And in the nanosecond that it took her to answer yes, she thought about it, and to her horror, it arrived in a priority mailbox 4 days later. And it looked like this. And so she did some research on the names, and there was a name that popped into her head, which seemed very familiar, and of course it's not popping into my head right now. I know her first name was Althea, I think, and so the name was very familiar to Megan, and Megan is one of those historians who's lived in Belfast forever and has read everything available. So she went back into some of the early records of the speeches that were given at Old Home Day. And she found a speech by this, it's Augusta Quimby, there it is, thank you. Augusta Quimby in 1913 had given a talk about her work during the Civil War in which they made quilts. And she talked about the making of a flag quilt. So Megan Pinette called up the library and said, "Do we have anything in special collections from the Ladies' Aid Society of Belfast?" And half an hour later, the librarian called her back, and Megan joined my Screamers Club. Because not only did they have stuff on the Civil War, they had the actual minutes of the Belfast Ladies' Aid Society with a special pamphlet inside it that told about the making of the flag quilt in Belfast. And what had happened is they had a special request from a Maine nurse who was serving at the hospital that I showed you, and someone's phone's going. It's not mine. Okay, here we go. The Armory Square Hospital, and she requested a flag quilt be made, and they have that letter in this pamphlet. So a group of young women got together, and what's hard to see is that every white area has inscriptions on it. So I had a couple of details, and they were wonderful inscriptions of those 24 women. But how did the quilt get into Montana? Well, the story is this. This is Willard Bliss, who was the administrating physician of the Armory Square Hospital after the war. His daughter also married a physician who became a physician to the Western tribes and moved to Montana. And we think the quilt traveled with them. Neighbor A died 30 years before this phone call came in. And the parents of neighbor B were burning everything. And neighbor, oh wait a minute, go get it right. Neighbor A had the quilt. Neighbor B saw it go into the burn pile and asked if they could have it. Neighbor A said yes, took it. It went into their closet for 30 years. And when the family was cleaning out this house, they found the quilt, saw that it came from Belfast, Maine, and sent it to Belfast. So Belfast raised a lot of money and had the quilt restored. That's a poor picture of the restored quilt below it, but they did a beautiful job. And let me just read you one excerpt from one of the Sanitary Commission bulletins. Flag quilts were important to those who made and received them, and letters concerning flag quilts appeared in that bulletin I told you from the Sanitary Commission, and here it is. Headquarters, 202nd Regiment, Pennsylvania Volunteers, Fairfax Station, Virginia, May 10th, 1865. Fair sex. I am a soldier in the above-named regiment, and also am in receipt of a few lines pinned on one of your quilts, and feel heartily glad to know that we are not forgotten by the fair ones at home. You asked the question for me to inform you whether us soldiers receive such articles. I will answer by saying to the society that we do. Also, my bed has on a very nice clean white sheet and pillow with a white slip on. I need not tell you of the pleasant dreams I've had, but the first night the flag quilt was spread over me, I did dream of the loved ones far away. So that's what the quilts from home meant to the soldiers. Thank you. Thus ends my tale.
My name's Ann Maley. I live in Linden Ponds now. Excuse me. I used to be on the board of the New England Quilt Museum, and one of the things that impressed me then and is impressing me again today is we wouldn't know any of this if women didn't sign their quilts. And my friends roll their eyes. There she goes again. But I keep saying to quilters, sign your quilts. Say where it was made. If there's a reason, put that on. Put the child's name and birth date, because in 2 generations, nobody will know where this quilt came from. And women's work needs to be acknowledged.
I'm twice as bad as you. Will all the quilters in the room raise your right hand? I promise from this day forward. I'm not kidding. I will sign my quilt.